I just tell the truth, and telling the truth is crazy in a world full of lies.
Hello guys, welcome to the Mill Press, a time capsule for all things Bible related. We have been breaking down covenant over the last 6 weeks, and now we're moving on to episode 7, the covenant of God. So, last week we discussed how covenant begins with God. But how did it begin? In Genesis chapter 6, we see the word covenant when God comes up to Noah and says, I will establish a covenant with you. And you see, God begins a covenant when he was broken hearted, when he saw his creation indulging in sin, when his perfect creation began to do wicked, evil things as their hearts naturally made them do, as they conspire within themselves, as they wanted. Everybody did as they saw fit. Well, God saw his creation. He was broken over his perfect creation being completely imperfect, completely wicked, completely sinful. And he says, I'm going to wash away this wickedness. I'm going to bring a flood, right? And before he does, he sets his eyes on Noah. Not because Noah is perfect, but because Noah is righteous. What's the difference? A righteous person has a moral law. It means he knew right and wrong, and even though his heart was still inclined to evil, even though he was not a perfect man, he understood his need for perfection. He was blameless. What does that mean? It means that he was complete. Unlike Cain, who was lineage of taking and taking and taking, Noah was whole. He was complete. He followed the teachings of his father. All of this was important because amidst all of that imperfection, God sets his eyes on Noah to bring about perfection. He separates Noah, puts him on a higher plateau, higher ground where he gets on the Ark of the Covenant. The waters come, the boat is lifted up to a higher ground, a higher state of morality, and it is there that God begins to do a new work. Why do I say that? Well, after a few weeks, few months, Noah comes out of the ark, and the first thing he does is offer up a sacrifice. Why? Why do you see the need for sacrifice come up again and again and again throughout this narrative? It's because God is perfect, and you and me, we are not. We are imperfect. And in order to do anything with God, we need to pay the price to cleanse us, to rid us of the punishment, which is death. And we discussed how back in the day, someone else, well, an animal, will take on that punishment, symbolizing the death that you deserve, so that you can then enter into covenant with God. Well, we finished the episode concluding and explaining how God extends grace. I will never again destroy the earth. And then it says, even though, Noah, your heart is still inclined to evil. And what we see is we are entering covenant. We are entering into a relationship with God in order for God to come and begin to perfect our imperfection, so that he can begin to perfect us out of our imperfection, so that he can begin to do something with you. This is why you go to church. This is why you become a Christian, so that God can begin a work with you. So now we're going to see, what does that work look like? What does the covenant of God look like? What does it mean to have true covenant with God? And with that, we're going to go into becoming one with God. This is an amazing chapter, because we're going to skip from chapter 10, we're going to skip now to chapter 15, where we see Abram, who later became Abraham, enter a covenant with God. And this is where you get the picture of marriage, walking down the aisle. You'll see how everything that we do today points right back to this moment where we make a pact, we make a covenant, we make and give our word to do as we have said we will do. So let's get into the covenant of God. Now, chapter 15 of the book of Genesis begins just like we have seen throughout this whole theme. That covenant begins with a word from God. It begins with God. He is the initiator of covenant, right? So the same way that he put his eyes on Noah and says, hey, I will establish a covenant with you as a promise that was later fulfilled 3 chapters later in chapter 10. I will now make a covenant with you. And you see that covenant begins with God. It doesn't begin with men. It begins with God. So the same way you see the Lord comes up to Abram and he says, hey, don't be afraid. I am your shield, your very great reward. And that sounds a bit strange, right? Like, why is that the first thing he says? It didn't make much sense until you read the next verse. Sovereign Lord, right? Abram recognizes you are above it all. What can you give me since I am childless? And this is important because what you have to understand is the Bible is filled with meaningful interpretations. And when I say interpretations, I mean translations. Because Abram means exalted father. But Abram had no kids. So his very name was contradictory to his lifestyle. I want you to understand that because when God says, hey, I have something for you, a great reward, what have we been discussing? That we see a fathering extending from Adam to Seth and through the lineage of God. And now we get to Abram, the exalted father, and he doesn't have a child to father. So when God brings him something great, his first response is, whatever you give me will die with me because I don't have a child. I cannot fulfill my very duty as your son to father my child because I have none. And I love that because, again, you see that he is aligning with the things of God. He's saying, listen, I was brought here to do a purpose as a father, to go ahead and make a son in my own image and likeness, teach him your ways as my father has taught me your ways. And it's just a fathering that takes place. So when God brings up to Abram, hey, listen, I'm going to do something great. It's going to be a great reward. I am your recompense. Abram is saying, whatever you give me will die with me. I am fatherless. And I love that because what he's pointing back to is, God, I need your help. And it's this act of humility that moves God's heart. We discuss how we need mercy. However, you won't ask for mercy unless you recognize your need of it. Right? So when you see that these people have been offering a sacrifice, they have a moral code that they know they cannot fulfill. They are not perfect. So they constantly fail. And then they give an offering saying, look, I have failed you again. I wish I didn't. I want to be better. Forgive me. And it's a constant state of awareness to your condition. And Abram had it the worst of all because his very name pointed to the very purpose of God fathering through the generations. So I love that because then he says, God looks at his mindset. He looks at his heart and then he takes him outside. And then he says, look at the sky and count the stars. And if indeed you can count them, right? If you can get to count all of them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And let me tell you why that's such a powerful verse. Because when you consider covenant, you see it begin with a promise, right? He told Noah, hey, I will make a covenant with you, all right? So build an ark because I'm going to bring rain and I'm going to cleanse this earth of all these wicked people. And Noah begins to build an ark. Right? Theologians say that he was building the ark anywhere from 55 to 120 years before the rain actually came. What am I trying to point to? Faith. It's believing God. Covenant, just like marriage. No one enters a marriage thinking is going to fail. And likewise, no one enters covenant without believing what God has declared in his word. Noah built for 55 years when there was no rain. All right? You don't know what will happen, but you trust God in his word because covenant requires faith. So, Abram, the exalted father who was childless, how do you met that? Well, you believe God. It says that Abraham believed the Lord and he credited to him righteousness. And I love that because when you look through this concept, you see that faith, right? You see that trust and direction, they go hand in hand when it comes to the things of the Bible. Like if God tells you something, then it requires that you walk in it. That's why you have like Psalms 23. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet water. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake." What is he saying? He's saying, the Lord leads me, and wherever he leads me is good. I trust him to lead me because trust and direction go hand in hand. Covenant is becoming one with God. And in order to do that, you must agree to him leading you. Why does he need to lead you? Because God is perfect and you are imperfect. In fact, if you were perfect, you guys will be in sync. But because you're not perfect, he needs to hold your hand and guide you. You need to follow him. That's why nowadays we learn righteousness and we learn right and wrong, and it's like a social construct or the norm or the cultural applications that we have. We say, oh, this is what's right because the collective sum says this is right, but God says no, I am perfect. You want to enter into this relationship, you got to be one with me. He says you will have descendants as numerous as the stars. And then he tells them that he will take possession of a land for those descendants to occupy. Which is interesting because then Abram asked, how do I know I will take possession of it? And then God instructs Abram to to get the requirements for covenant. And it gives you this picture. Abram believed God that he will have many descendants, as many as the stars. That's one. But now God also tells him, and those descendants will occupy a specific land. And when he asked, how will I know that I would take possession of that land? He says, enter into a covenant with me. And you know what you get from there? You get the concept of marriage. That if I have property, you as my spouse get property. Like what's mine is yours. And the reason why Abram is getting this land is because when you read Psalms 24, it says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, everything belongs to God. He says, everything is mine. And if you join me in covenant, everything will be yours also, because we will be one. Like, how amazing is that? That he says, everything that I have, when you enter into covenant, will be everything that you have. What I have, I give to you. That's how amazing covenant is. This is why it's important, because we religiously sometimes try to earn our way to God's graces. But when you look through the Bible, when you look through covenant, it's God who wins you over because he loves you even in your imperfection, brings you near, and then having you brought you near, having separate you from the rest, he begins to do a work in you so that you can become one, and that in that oneness, you get to have everything that is his. You get to share in the things that belong to him because you are one with him. That's covenant. That is the beauty of marriage. That my resources that I work for, the name that I have gained for myself, everything that I am as a man, I have now given to my wife because marriage is a fathering, it's a giving, it's an investing into because God has always been gracious, merciful, abundant in mercy. His goodness never fails. His love is everlasting. He does not lack in giving. And this is what you see in covenant. Now, this is going to get a little bit weird, so just bear with me and then I explain to you why this is so important, right? Because when you get to verse 9, it says, "So the Lord said to Abram, bring me a heifer, which is a female cow, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite to each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Right? And now you're looking at me like, what is going on? Why would you take these animals and literally cut them in half and separate them, right, opposite to each other? Now, this may be strange to us now. However, when you go back to that time and zone in the Middle East, this was a normal practice when forming alliances, pacts, agreements, even after a ceasefire during a war. You will get two generals, and what they will do is they will bring an animal and they would cut it in half. And then the two parties that are joining this pact, this covenant, this agreement will walk down this aisle of body parts of the slaughtered animals. And it will be them walking through it saying as a declaration, if I should break the words of this pact, let me be split apart. Let me be killed as these animals were killed. So, throughout the Bible, you will see that your word is symbolic of your character, right? Your word is bond. So, if you break your word, you are basically bringing in division within yourself and within people. This ancient practice is it's a visible representation of what happens when you break your word. And he's saying, listen, if I break this word, let me be split apart. Let me be killed. And this is what you get the imagery of walking down the aisle, going to the altar and saying until death do us apart. Right? So it may seem dark, but it's just to let you know how serious God takes your word. Your word is important. This is why God hates liars. Because you lying, it's breaking the very fabric of what makes a covenant, right? When you consider every global war, crisis, everything that's going on within humanity, it has all happened because someone has broken a specific treaty, agreement, or limit that they have set forth. You consider everything that's happening in Gaza is because, again, they broke a treaty to where you can settle. When you look at Ukraine, right, it's because NATO said that they would not move further east into the territory of the east, but they did. And now you have this war. Why? Because you're breaking your word. Every major catastrophe within the human civilization happens because someone has broken a treaty, covenant, pact, agreement. So when God looks at this, he's like, look, I want you to see a visible reminder of what happens when you break a covenant with me. You will be split apart. And this is what you see here. You see that God is trying to show you your word matters to me, right? The whole 10 commandments, these are words saying, hey, I will not break this commandment. And because I don't break it, I enter into a relationship with you and you're going to bless me. It's a word agreement. You have said so with your word, and with your own word, you break it. This is what is showing you the repercussions of your words, right? Now, again, in this context, the whole way that it will work is that you will go ahead, separate the pieces, and then you will both parties will walk through it. But I kid you not, I'm looking through it, right? Because again, this is the Lord making a covenant with Abram. It's important because you see there's one heifer, right? Which is a female cow, which is symbolically the type of offering you bring to atone for your sin. And I love that because he's only bringing one, not two. That's important because what it's showing you is, hey, out of the two people, Abram and God, who are entering this covenant, only one of us needs atonement, Abram. So from the beginning, he's like, listen, you're going to enter into my covenant. You have to atone for your sin. Me who is perfect, cannot go into a covenant with someone that's not perfect. So bring a heifer, right? And I love that. I love that because God from the beginning, it's like you recognize you are not perfect. You need salvation. You need cleansing of sin. Get me a heifer, right? And then you get to the two things, right? You have a goat and a ram. And now I was scratching my head for some time, like, why? Why do you need a goat and a ram? Because you got to consider this aisle that has been formed, right? Of these body parts of the animals. When you consider the aisles, you can imagine one side of this aisle refers to the goat and another side refers to the ram. What sets them apart? Well, a goat has horns that stretch straight, whereas a ram has horns that curve. So when you look into the word wickedness in Hebrew, it means that you are crooked. And when you look at the things of God, it's always a straight path. And then from the gate, he's saying, listen, I keep to a straight path. You have a crooked way of life. So he's bringing him into covenant despite his imperfection. I love that. Like that's God. Like it's like you don't change who you are to then enter into God's presence. No, you enter into God's presence, then he changes who you are. Right? And then you move on to the verse. It says, hey, bring me a pigeon. No, bring me a dove and a young pigeon. Now, in the Hebrew, it's basically just a turtle dove, right? Like it's just a bird. But then the young pigeon is featherless. Like it doesn't have any feathers. Why? Because you'll notice throughout the Bible, the presence of God is like a covering, right? Because God is holy, he's also covered, right? Being naked, like look at Adam and Eve. When they became aware that they were naked, they try to cover up, right? Nakedness, it's also symbolic of sin, right? It means you don't have no covering. Why? Because the name, remember, the name is a covering. Well, if you don't have a covering, that means you don't have a name. That means you don't have relationship. And he's saying, listen, I have feathers. I am covered by my own name, says the Lord. But no, about Abram, he doesn't. He has the name Abram even though he doesn't have a son. He doesn't have a covering. And what you see this perfect God choosing to enter into a relationship with a imperfect man. And that's the story of the Christian. That this perfect God was gracious and merciful enough to look at us in our imperfection and says, I want him. I want her. I will put up the sacrifice so they can enter into my covenant. That's how amazing God is. Now, I want you to remember what I said, right? The covenant takes place, is finalized when both parties walk through the aisle. And that's important because when you read through the account of what actually happened, this is not what you see. If anything, it says this. It says, verse 17, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. And that's it. And my first thought is like, wait, hold up. Abram never passed through the pieces. but that he's considered to have passed through them. Why? Well, when you look throughout the Bible, God has always manifested as a fire, right? When you consider the pots of clay, it's always symbolic of man, right? And when you consider the smoke that proceeds from the fire, smoke is symbolic of the Spirit of God. When you look through this verse carefully, what you see is the Trinity. Jesus, right? The Word made flesh, the very nature of the Father, fire, while also the very nature of man, clay. And from him you see what? The proceeding of the Holy Spirit that we spoke last time. I say all of that to say, because when you get to the New Testament, you read the book of Hebrews, the author in chapter 6, at the end of chapter 6, speaks about this moment. And he says, God made a promise to Abram because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear. And then he says, our forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf. He has become a priest forever. What is he trying to say? That if the punishment for breaking the covenant is to be torn apart, and you broke that covenant, who was torn apart on our behalf? Jesus. That the same way that the pieces of these animals was torn apart, so was his back torn apart for us. The same way that that these pieces were killed, he was killed on our behalf. The same way that we could not walk that path, he walked the path for us. And what you see is, again, God saying, I will be the one to bring it about. That's how amazing God is. That from the gate, he's like, I don't need you to go ahead and enter this covenant just to break it. Nah, I want to make a perfect covenant, and you are not perfect. So I'm going to send someone to go on your behalf so that he can make a covenant so that you could never break what he has put in place, because the covenant is fulfilled in him. He does it perfectly, and he takes on the punishment for even breaking it. Thereby is unchanging. That's the covenant of God. It's a everlasting covenant bound in his own blood. That Jesus took on sin and the punishment of sin being ripped apart on our behalf so that we can enter into a covenant with God everlasting. This is why the picture of covenant with God is the greatest picture you will ever get to perfect unity. Because even when you failed, his punishment is enough. Even when you do the worst, his punishment is enough. He took on the price of your sin so that you can walk down the aisle and be one with him. So I hope you guys enjoy this piece in this amazing chapter on the covenant of God. We're going to be disclosing a little bit deeper about what that actually means. We're going to take a little bit back to the New Testament so you guys can see the totality of everything God has in store for you, even from the beginning in Genesis. So guys, take care, and thank you for listening.